We are really excited to have a fantastic group here today. There's always interest in our Legislative Outlook panel. Having just heard from Senator Perry, maybe y'all are thinking you need to modify some of your comments, I don't know, but nevertheless, we have some great folks joining us. Appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this. Many of these are familiar faces. We've got Robby Cook, a former member of the House of Representatives. He was most recently special advisor to former Speaker Dennis Bonnen and longtime lobbyist who recently started a new firm, Eichler and Cook, back in the lobbying world in the groundwater space. So welcome, happy to have you at TAGD. Embrey, principal at Lloyd Gosselink, extensive experience at the Capitol, both on staff and representing clients in legislative affairs. Also robust legal practice representing groundwater districts and other special districts. Sarah Kirkle, the Legislative and Policy Director at TWCA, and before that role, she spent 13 years, I believe, at the Sunset Commission. And finally, Shauna Sledge, partner at SledgeLaw, experienced attorney who focuses on legislative affairs, water, and government. Welcome, all of you. Thank you.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Good to be here. Thank you.
All right, so we are going to start with you, Ty, if that's okay. Would you mind sharing with the group, take just 2 minutes and kind of give the audience a brief overview of the big picture for this session? What do you think the big priorities are? Oh, Ty, you're muted. Let's see here. If we can't. So it shows that you are unmuted. Unfortunately, your audio is not coming through.
Maybe it's
Julie,
Bluetooth with your headphones.
I'll email him something that he can use to call in.
Perfect. All right. While we're waiting for that, Ty, I might take the big picture away from you and move on and throw that one to you, Robby. Would you mind stepping in and sharing with the group your thoughts on kind of the big picture for the session? Well,
I think Senator Perry did a really good job of covering it on the Senate side and certainly on the House side. I think, of course, the COVID, and we're going to talk about COVID more in detail, but I think that they are trying to be as transparent as they can. They're trying to allow public input as much as possible as they have in the past. I know through the various conversations they've had in trying to figure out how not only to open the Capitol, but open both the House chambers and the Senate chamber, but at the same time be cognizant of the pandemic. And so it's going to be, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in general too. How do we get around? How do we operate? How will all the different offices operate under this pandemic? And of course, Senator Perry talked about the mandatory testing and the masking on the Senate side, on the House side, and we'll talk about that too. There's not mandatory testing necessarily, but there is mask. So that's certainly this overriding picture on how do we all operate in this atmosphere. The budget.
Hear me now?
We can, yes. Okay. Glad to have you working. Thanks for bearing with us.
Yeah, sorry about that.
And then Ty, you can take it from here.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, you know, we're going to struggle. We're going to get through this like we have with a lot of things through COVID. You know, I think there's new rules, and we're going to talk about that later in the panel. But, you know, we'll adjust just like we've done with everything. And like I've said to many other people, I think as the vaccinations go, what the session looks like now and what it looks like in April and May might be very different depending on how the vaccination process goes. So, but that's a reality that we have to live with. Budget, we're in a better budget situation. It's not great. COVID definitely did a number, and the international oil fight between Saudi Arabia and Russia, you know, affected oil and gas prices. which affects the tax revenue that the state collects. So that we were really, the numbers being trotted out by Comptroller Hager in September or in the summer were really scary. But thankfully, the numbers he announced for in the Monday before the session started on January 12th, they're not great, but they're a whole lot better. And so the budget, there's a little bit less money to work with for the state, but it's for the next 2 years, but it's close to what it was 2 years ago. And we definitely have I think a $1 billion shortfall from the current budget that they're going to have to address. So that's the one bill the Texas Constitution requires the legislature to adopt during the session. So they have to adopt a budget. So that'll soak up a lot of air in the room. Redistricting, Robby's going to get into that more. That's the census was done last year. We'll get the numbers later this year, as Chairman Perry said. But that's something that will be part of the equation this session that normally is not part of the equation during a regular session. But we do it every 10 years. You can definitely see some themes with bills that are filed. And because of what happened in our country over the last year, you're seeing a lot of police reform bills. Now, do I think a lot of them will pass? Probably not. But I think the amount of police reform bills that have been filed are pretty significant. I think the law enforcement agencies are looking for a way to try to help address some of the issues that might have popped up over the last year. And then elections, our country received, we spent a lot of time working on the elections in November, that occurred in November of last year. You're seeing a lot of bills that to address situations that came out of the elections process during COVID. I don't know what will ultimately pass, but I think you're definitely going to have a lot of the elections committees in both hearings, the elections committee in the House, the State Affairs Committee in the Senate are going to be very busy. And then just the number of bills filed, it's amazing that here we are in COVID and you hear from the leadership, oh, we're going to have less bills, less activity. We're trying to limit activity, but yet as of about 10 minutes ago, they'd filed 1,920 bills. Which was about 420 more than they had filed last year at this time. So they are way ahead of the pace as far as number of bills filed. They could start filing bills in November. And so I don't know if it's because people had time on their hands, they could work on legislation last year. But there's a significant amount of more bills filed. Haven't really seen it all that much in the water world, but overall the number of bills are significantly higher. I know at the TWCA TRWA conference last week, the gentleman from Ledge Council that spoke said that that the legislature was on a pace to meet the number from 2017 number of bills filed, but not 2019. So it'll be interesting to see if that pace of filing continues. But that's the pace we're on. Even during a pandemic, we're on a pretty heavy pace because the last two sessions we've had a lot of bills filed. So ultimately, I think last session we were over 7,000 bills filed. We're heading towards a number similar to that.
Thank you for that, Ty. Appreciate it. And then moving on, Shauna, it was an interim like no other. We did not have the hearings we expected, but we did see both the Natural Resources Committee and the Senate Water and Rural Affairs Committee issue interim reports. I was just curious if you had any thoughts on what those might tell us about the upcoming or current, I guess, now session.
Thanks, Leah. Good morning, everyone. So as always, Catherine did a great job and Shannon did a great job in drafting and preparing these interim reports. I think they are kind of like a crystal ball for what we're expecting to see and what we have seen filed already, specifically with respect to Senator Perry on a lot of their priorities as far as water issues go. The Senate interim report, their real focus and their passion during this interim has been produced water. We all heard Senator Perry discussing it, and they've really done a lot of work this interim, even though in light of COVID and our inability to have committee hearings, they've done a lot of work on this issue and really talking to stakeholders, and as Senator Perry said, we can expect a bill, I think probably next week will be filed. They have a draft out of Ledge Committee as of yesterday on produced water. And I think it does a good job of, balancing the different interests and really focusing on their desire to learn more about this issue, and noting the fact that it might be premature in terms of previous legislation that we've seen on produced water. There's really a lot of moving parts when we're talking about produced water. And I know that the groundwater folks really care about produced water. So one thing noted in the interim report is the fact that it will, take some of the heat off of the injection wells that we're seeing. A lot of my groundwater district clients have UIC programs that are monitoring these injection wells and, protesting them if there's a risk to the freshwater resources. So hopefully utilizing produced water in a more meaningful, beneficial use manner will take some pressure off of that. The bill will be creating a consortium that will partner with Texas Tech and composed of different stakeholder groups, and kind of work on looking at the technology, looking at policy recommendations, but also coming together and formulating a pilot program, and that will hopefully dovetail into future legislation with legislative oversight in that program and that process. Additionally, as Senator Perry said, there's also a focus on groundwater in the interim report. While they do praise districts for their transparency, and I think, the relationship with Senator Perry and districts have really come a long way, there is room for improvement noted in the report, specifically with respect to private property rights, the attorney's fees issue. Obviously, that's a priority, as well as
a lot of those we'll talk about later on as well. So,
I won't get into that, and just private property rights and creating free markets for folks to, profit from their water rights. And then in the House Natural Resources report, it was the focus, there were fewer recommendations with respect to groundwater, primarily focused on the DFC process, specifically once a DFC, if declared unreasonable, are no longer reasonable, as Sarah will talk about later. So I think, we're going to obviously see some legislation on that. And then I think we can expect some legislation on the groundwater surface water interaction as it's stated and provided for in the report. So that's my 2 cents on that issue.
Great, thanks for that kind of overview of those reports. They obviously did do a wonderful job putting those together, and putting them together under very unusual circumstances, not being able to have the same meetings and conversations and having to get information through more creative means. So they have done a wonderful job. So moving on, for returning, I guess, to COVID, we've been wondering for a long time what the session was going to look like with COVID, and I think we're starting to see some clarity on that. Session began on the 12th, and so Sarah, I was hoping you could just take a minute and kind of cover COVID capital protocols for us.
Sure, and Senator Perry covered some of this too. What you see largely are restrictions on times and entry points, and what is interesting is there was a AG opinion recently that informed some of this, and then what we're going to talk about next as far as House and Senate rules. And that the Constitution requires that when the legislature comes to town and meets for session, that the Capitol has to be open and accessible to the public. So when we've had these conversations about, will the Capitol be open, to what extent will the Capitol be closed, one of the representatives filed an AG opinion just really questioning, well, given that the Constitution requires the Capitol to be open and you have First Amendment protections there, to what extent can we restrict the public's access to the Capitol? And the AG ruled that it's fine that the legislature impose reasonable conditions on the time, the place, and the manner of the access, as long as it's content neutral, so it doesn't infringe on the First Amendment. But it's also, the Constitution allows each house to adopt their own set of rules. So they can adopt whatever they want when it comes to public access, with conducting public testimony, debate, voting on legislation. And And the Constitution has this concept about quorum, and it's tied to the word attendance. And so that brought up some more questions about, does that mean physical presence to count for quorum and for attendance? And that's important because the House and the Senate both, there were questions from members about, given the COVID situation, can I vote from my office? Can I vote from my district? What sort of remote voting can we do? And so this question was very important to answer because the House ultimately adopted a set of rules that allows some spacing out. So members don't have to necessarily be on the House floor. They have secure portable devices and they are able to use them in the gallery. They're able to use them on the same floor in some of the adjoining rooms like the members lounge, and there's a speakers conference room. So some of these different areas that are right there next to the floor where they're very close, but they do have access to vote. And you know, you've got 150 people down there. They've got some plexiglass shields, but it's a difficult situation when you have potential super spreading events like that. On these House and Senate rules here, I'm going to give you just the basic rules. You know, you've got some similarities about the mask, the social distancing, the opportunity to test when you go into a member's office. And Senator Perry covered that public testimony is going to be in person, but you can watch virtually. You can submit comments in writing. So if you're not comfortable going to the Capitol, there are some options there. The difference really is that the House voted not to require members or guests to have to test in order to enter the House floor or the House chamber or committee rooms, whereas the Senate did require that senators or visitors, if you go into the Senate chamber or you go into a Senate committee room, you have to have a negative test. So it's a little confusing because there is testing available on the north lawn to get into the Capitol. You could get a positive test, you could still get into the Capitol, but you could not get into the Senate chamber or a Senate committee room. And I think Shauna is going to give you some advice on what all this means as far as, well, how do I engage?
Exactly. That's exactly where we were going to go next. You know, Shauna, if you could just, for those of us out there that want to talk to legislative staff or meet with representatives, how do we do this in a way that fits with the current COVID world that we're living in?
Okay, well, the first thing you need to do is contact the office that you're wanting to engage in, because they each have their own, you know, rules in their own little office or committee office. So you want to, you know, be upfront and say, I have this issue. I'd really like to talk to you, whether it's on the phone, Zoom, whatever it makes them the most comfortable. I know that the Senate Committee on Water and Rural Affairs, they're doing a lot of virtual meetings. I haven't heard the same in the House. And it will kind of be up to, you know, whoever the chair may be of that committee and how they want to go about conducting meetings. But as for just any office at the Capitol, whether it's water related or not, contact that office. Ask them what are your protocols for meeting or getting in front and talking to y'all. Most offices have some guidelines listed on their door of what specifically needs to be done in order to meet with that office, because some offices doors are locked right now and some have open door policies, so they're all a little different. I would recommend after contacting the office, you know, making sure you get tested on the north entrance and only entering if you have proof that you have a negative test. I think they're handing out stickers. So if you are going to go in the Capitol, wear that sticker. I think it puts everybody at ease. Always have a mask on. But yeah, kind of just figuring out what specifically, in addition to getting tested and a mask, if you are going to meet in person, having an appointment, not just showing up at someone's office unannounced. Definitely contacting beforehand and seeing how they want to go about it in the safest way possible.
Yeah, definitely. A lot about respect for sure of different people's comfort levels. So kind of moving on, and we started talking about this, but there have been some changes to the House and Senate rules beyond kind of COVID that are of note. Ty, would you just take a minute to hit some of the high points that kind of affect the procedure in the two chambers?
Yeah, right. As far as the House, most of the changes were focused on how to deal with COVID, or holding proceedings during COVID, during a pandemic. New Rule 16 provides a lot of new information on how the House is gonna handle that. One of the things that I thought, and just to reiterate what's already been said about having, quorum can be 2 members in person, and then all the other members can participate in the committee hearing virtually. So that's a pretty big change that will occur while they're during a meeting during a pandemic. And then so the House, they considered having a new calendar called a consensus calendar, but after a lot of debate, that was ultimately voted down. So all the calendars are still the same that we've had in the past. And then as far as the Senate, there was a pretty significant change that was non-related to COVID, even though they addressed COVID issues in the Senate rules. But one of the biggest changes was changing the rules as far as bills being brought to the floor of the Senate for debate and action. For many years, there was a 2/3 vote. You had to have 2/3 of the senators vote to bring a bill to the floor. And I'm putting this in very simple terms. It's a little more complicated than that, but in very simple terms, you had to have 2/3 vote. Then recently, the Senate changed those rules last session to have a 3/5 vote, so that would be 19 members. And then this session, they changed it to 5/9, which would be 18 members. And of course, it wouldn't surprise you that the reason the numbers have changed is to make sure that they're, one party, the Republican Party, is has the most amount of members in the Senate. They'd be able to bring bills to the floor that they feel are very important to them, and they could have a straight party line vote, and that would enable that bill to be brought to the floor of the Senate. The reason they went from 19 to 18 was there was one Senate race that it was Pete Flores, a Republican, had wanted in a special election to replace Senator Uresti. And then in the general election in November, House member Roland Gutierrez won that, who's a Democrat. So it lowered the number of Republicans in the Senate to 18. So this Republicans lowered the number of votes needed to bring a bill to the floor for debate and action to 18. So that was a pretty significant change in the Senate rules that was made earlier this year.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. And then just quickly mentioning, we're going to be moving on to committees. The other thing that happened was that the committee was dissolved and now is back. Those topics are back in what is now Water, Ag, and Rural Affairs, which is a perfect segue to Robby. I was hoping you could kind of cover for us the House and Senate committees that oversee groundwater. On the Senate side, appointments have been made. They came out, I think, about a week ago. I've got those listed up here. Could you just kind of give a minute or two on your insights? What does this committee tell us about what the session may look like for groundwater?
Well, I think that, again, since you have the Senate committee up first, if you look at the vice chair, Senator Drew Springer from Munster, Texas, he's a House member, and he ran in the special election, won the special election that Senator Pat Fallon had held. But he's the vice chair. Ironically, him and Senator Perry both are from that part of the Texas, I guess West Texas. Senator Springer has a lot of Denton County, a lot of Collin County, and then the rural areas around that area. And you have some new members. You have Senator Sarah Eckhart, Austin area, Senator Beverly Powell, Senator Roland Gutierrez from San Antonio. So you have some new members on that committee. And I think Senator Perry made a very, very good point about when someone asked the question, how many bills? How many additional bills where there will be, and he mentioned the fact that sure the members are welcome to file bills. As we all know, part of what we do, and I'll mention this actually both committees, part of what we do as consultants or lobbyists or groundwater district managers or whoever, when we're trying to, it's educating. You're always going to have some turnover, and Senator Perry mentioned it. A lot of times people, they come in and they've had either folks from back home or someone else bring them a bill and say, well, there's a big problem with the water world, either GCDs or whoever it is, so you're going to see a lot of bills filed. And I certainly appreciate Senator Perry mentioning the fact that, okay, you don't want to pass a bill or file something that totally upends water law. Water law has been, we've developed water law for over 100 years in Texas. So although someone may think that it's something that's certainly worth the debate, doesn't mean that you won't see bills filed. It just means you'll see some education being done and usually more so the newer committee members. But on the Senate side, rural affairs, water, ag, and rural affairs, I think Senator Springer, since he has both an urban and rural area, I think he's going to do a really good job. And he's great to work with. His staff is great to work with. I've known him for several years, so I think he's going to be very, very open as to what direction not only the rest of the members want to do, but I think he's going to work very closely with Senator Perry, has in the past. And then on the House side, you have turnover. You have Jessica Farrar, which is no longer a House member. She retired. Mike Lang, Representative Mike Lang, and then Representative Pato Navarez. So then you got 3 vacancies right there. And then Cody Harris, Representative Cody Harris. He is from Palestine, East Texas. He's the one who has filed the companion bills to Senator Perry on 152 and others. So Representative Harris has been one who his office has always been very open, easy to talk to, open to suggestions. So
on that one, Robby, just for our audience, I want to clarify. So the House has not yet appointed a chair or members to the Natural Resources Committee. So we're still
I should have mentioned that. Yes, we have the Senate
appoints, right? So what we've got up here is a list of the committee members from last session.
That's correct.
What are your thoughts? Do you think that we're going to see some of these folks remain on the committee? And what about that chair spot?
Well, you have a new Speaker of the House. So by the sheer nature of new leadership, you will see, and I'm not saying Chair Larson won't be chair next session, this session. He may stay there because Representative Larson is, whether he's there or not, he's go-to guy on water issues. And so wherever he winds up, he may be chairman of another committee, or he may stay chair of House Natural Resources. People will still look to Chair Larson as to what happens by the time a bill goes to the committee or hits the House floor. But having said that, you have Chair Lyle Larson, who's still in the House. You have Vice Chair Will Metcalf, who is still a House member. You have Cody Harris, who is second term. You have Anna Eastman. You have Mike Lang, who will no longer be there. You have several members. And what I'd like to say also is whenever there's appointments and the Speaker looks at the members of the Natural Resources Committee, that's one of those committees that's usually not political. It's usually regional. So leadership usually tries to get a good mix of rural and urban, if you will, and possibly North Texas, West Texas, the Valley, East Texas, the urban areas. So there's usually a lot of focus on how you look at how the makeup of that committee becomes more regional than it does political. And we have Representative Tracy King, who's been on the committee for a very, very long time. He's been there even the session 2 before I got there. And he's always been great to groundwater conservation districts. And Chairman King has the respect of leadership. He has respect of all the other House members. He has respect of Chairman Larson and other. So he's also one of the go-to guys when it comes to water and specifically groundwater.
Thank you for that. So,
Leah, can I say one thing that I'd be interested to hear, Robby, is this whole concept of seniority in the House and how that impacts committees. That's kind of a House nuance that I guess if you could explain a little bit about how the seniority works as far as committee assignments.
Well, whenever it starts, whenever the committee, and actually I think by today, the members have to turn in their preference card, and all the members turn in a preference card to the House Parliamentarian's office, and then, of course, the Speaker, they look at, on the preference card, you have seniority picks, and for example, Representative Tracy King certainly has seniority, Chair Larson certainly has seniority, so there's certain seniority picks, and then there are preference picks, committees that members, especially in the younger members, it may not always, seniority certainly doesn't kick in until you're probably there the 3rd or 4th sessions. So the Speaker tries to match the members' preferences as much possible when the member House Natural Resources number 1, or administration number 2, and maybe appropriations number 3, or whoever. So there is a preference that members usually that do put on that card, and leadership tries their best to try to figure out how that member can best not only serve their districts, but also how that member could add to whatever committee that meet, natural resources. And it may be where the member during the campaigns, a lot of issues, people come to them and say, hey, water is a big deal, either groundwater, surface water, or in the middle of drought, or it could be agriculture interest or whatever. But Ty, I think I'm answering your question. The seniority is certainly something that the speaker has to look at. If someone with some seniority requests, for example, a House Natural Resources Committee, that puts more emphasis on the speaker to try to acknowledge that seniority comes first for that member than probably someone with less seniority.
Thank you for that. So we are running about 10 minutes behind because we have, there's just been so much going on. Just kind of want to alert y'all to that. So we'll try to kind of catch up, but I also don't want to give short shrift to the actual like groundwater topic. So you know, moving on, the next thing we're hoping to cover and segue into groundwater legislation. TWCA has been a place where consensus water legislation has been born for years and years and years. Sarah, could you take a few minutes and tell our audience about the consensus process briefly, and then specifically the work that the TWCA Groundwater Committee did this last fall?
Sure. So you see there, TWCA's mission, 3 components, and building consensus is the biggest one and the one that we spend the most time on. Advocating is probably the smallest amount, because if we do our job right and we get members of our association together, it's less opposition for the advocacy piece because we have folks, you know, together on those policies. So we have 2 different consensus policies and legislative committees, a surface water and a groundwater. They have about 150 participants apiece. They have representation from all different parts of the state and different perspectives on water use. And these committees are really where TWCA's legislative agenda is born. Legislative proposals that come through these committees require a 75% consensus at a subcommittee level and a 90% consensus among the voting members of a committee in order to move forward to the TWCA board. So there's some high bars, some thresholds that have to be met before TWCA will initiate legislation on a proposal. Typically what you see coming through these committees are issues that have been around for several sessions that continue to work on and that the members really feel the need to take up. The slide that you see right now is a list of the issues that members of TWCA submitted in a survey, an association-wide survey on what kinds of issues would we like to see the Groundwater Committee take up. And as you can see here, there's a couple of bigger picture issues, you know, joint planning process, CFC appeal process, but the large majority of what you see on this survey are smaller bite-sized things that the committee felt like they probably could take up. So next slide, you can see that the committee ultimately decided to, can we move to the next slide? There we go. Create 6 subcommittees. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the DFC piece. So the 6 subcommittees are here. The first one about DFCs is it's a very, very narrow topic that the subcommittee took up. You know, there's a lot of fingers and places that DFC discussions can go. This one is strictly about which DFC would apply in a management plan that's submitted to the water board if the DFC is declared unreasonable or it's under petition at the time. And the proposal that's coming from this subcommittee and from TWCA would be clear that the most recently adopted DFC would be the one that should be included in the management plan, regardless of whether that DFC is under petition or if that DFC has already been declared unreasonable. That is that is the bounds of this proposal. Again, very narrow. There were some questions.
Sarah, on that one, just to interject quickly, that is what Chairman Perry was referring to when he spoke about the DFCs being unreasonable and maybe getting wrapped into Senate Bill 152.
Yes, they're looking to include that. I think they've requested a committee sub to wrap this proposal into Senate Bill 152. And the, I lost my train of thought here. Oh, I just wanted to, you asked me to highlight, there was a little bit of confusion during the voting on this one. And it's because the initial proposal, there were a couple questions that came up during the voting process about, you know, some ambiguities in the proposal in the language that could have allowed a GCD that is under, whose DFC is under petition or declared unreasonable to not have to complete all of the components of the management plan. And that was not the intent of the subcommittee. And so we pulled the language back. We clarified that to make sure that it did what the subcommittee intended. And then we put that back out to a vote of the full committee, because the integrity of the process for us is much more important, to make sure that when we bring something to the Capitol, it has the support and there aren't questions about what came out of the process, right? So you can see on the other list here of the issues that came through TWCA, the process to petition a GCD for rulemaking, that made it into our legislative agenda. That is in Senate Bill 152. The notice of the permit application did not make it to meet the thresholds for TWCA. I think it was about 1 vote short at the subcommittee level. But that doesn't mean that the process still wasn't very important, because there were some compromises made through that process that are going to be wrapped into the bill. And I think that some of the stakeholders continue to work on that. And there will be further discussions on that. But it is in Senate Bill 152. You see here the deadline for filing a lawsuit about a final district decision did not meet the threshold. There was no proposal from an issue about the bed and banks permit versus waste, although I expect that that issue will continue to come up in future interims, especially if we start talking about produced water. And the use of permit fees, this is essentially mitigation that we're talking about, didn't quite get to a proposal. Attorney fees is a perennial issue since the last few sessions, and that was not put into a subcommittee at the TWCA, but the Groundwater Committee took that proposal up as a committee of the whole. However, that proposal did not get the support of the committee, so it's not something that TWCA is pursuing legislation on.
Great. And you've talked quite a bit now about these two, but just to reiterate, maybe these are the two priorities when it comes to groundwater that reached consensus, right?
They are, and I think Ty and maybe Shauna are going to talk a little bit more about them, but again, they are both in Senate Bill 152, and I think I've already given an overview of what these proposals are.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. So, okay, so yes, we've already talked a lot about 152, but right now, when we look at what's been filed in the groundwater space, it's not a whole lot of legislation. We've just seen a few bills filed. Senator Perry, Senate Bill 152 with the companion in the House, HB 668 with Paris, and that's got an omnibus title to it and has some parts that we're going to talk about. And then Representative Burns has also filed House Bill 966 regarding attorney's fees. And so we're going to touch on those. And Ty, Senate Bill 152 has 3 components: the petition to change rules, attorney's fees, and this notice requirement. You were one of the co-chairs of the TWCA subcommittee on the petition for rulemaking. Could you maybe briefly speak to what's in 152 and then that TWCA consensus language?
Sure. So basically the goal of the TWCA subcommittee dealing with this notice for rulemaking was to establish a process in Chapter 36 where a person or entity could file a petition to a groundwater district to, ask them to initiate a rulemaking process at that district. This is looked at, I know, by the Farm Bureau, and Chairman Perry has said it. They're looking for opportunities for citizens to, try to engage and interact with their groundwater district without having to go to the court and hiring a lawyer to do that. And this is one of the ways that has been suggested. Representative Cody Harris had a bill last session that dealt with this notice for, petition for rulemaking. We took the bill from last session, the subcommittee did, worked on it, tried to make it, it's very similar to the process that's already in Texas law, to how you would petition a state agency for rulemaking. So we tried to keep it pretty similar to that. But that's the goal of this, is to give a citizen an opportunity, a formalized process in Chapter 36 to be able to petition a district to initiate a rulemaking process. And a district could say no, but they would have to provide an explanation for why they would deny the petition for rulemaking. And then you want me to launch into the
Yeah, if you want, yeah, I've got your name by the attorney's fees provisions as well. So if you want to cover those, that would be great.
Sure. So there's some language in Senate Bill 152 and the House companion that the Farm Bureau is also interested in. It looks very similar to bills you've seen in the past. I think it's my understanding from talking to legislators and staff that they're going to narrow it to just the 36.066 part of the equation. There was another section of the bill that they're going to take out that was dealing with enforcement of a district's rules, and that's problematic for groundwater districts. If they can't enforce their rules without a threat of potentially having to pay attorney's fees, that's a problem. And so on the 36066 part of the equation, if someone sues a district saying, hey, I didn't get treated right, there's a problem with this decision a district made. If a district won and the individual lost, then the individual would have to pay the district's attorney's fees. Right now, that language in 36066 G says that it's the judge shall, if the district requests attorney's fees, the judge shall award those attorney's fees. And this was a deterrent to, these are governmental entities. They've got, limited funds. Groundwater districts, as you all know, they can't just keep getting hit with lawsuits. And this was a way that was put up to try to make sure that there wasn't just continuous litigation to try to hurt a groundwater district and frivolous lawsuits. So there's an effort by the Farm Bureau and the legislature, and Chairman Perry's got it in his bill that would change the may to a shall, excuse me, from a shall to a may. So it would be discretionary by the judge whether to grant attorney's fees if a district won when somebody sues that district. So it just is creating a little more discretion as opposed to the judges being required to award attorney's fees. And the ironic part is when looking at research and looking at other districts, a lot of them haven't even requested attorney's fees in the past. But it is nice to have that in Chapter 36 from my perspective, because it makes somebody think twice before they file a lawsuit against a district that language is in there.
Yes. So, and then just to clarify, and then it's in House Bill 966, Burns's bill, where there's currently a change proposed for attorney's fees on enforcement, but it's your understanding that that is going to be removed.
Correct. That the focus is going to be 36066, which is just, it doesn't impact the enforcement of a district's rules.
Right. Thank you for that. And then Shauna, I was hoping you could take a minute and discuss the notice provision that is contained in Senate Bill 152, what's in there now, and then also the alternative language that was worked on, but ultimately no consensus was achieved at TWCA.
Sure. So this notice requirement for an application for a permit amendment is an initiative by the Farm Bureau, and the intent is really, I think, reasonable and clear in that the intent is if you have a landowner in a district and the district has adopted spacing rules, and this landowner's drilling of a well and production of groundwater from that well preempts an adjacent landowner from being able to either drill a well or access their groundwater and their water rights, that landowner that would be impacted by the new well or the permit applicant receive notice of that application. So this is really the idea is to notify somebody with the private property rights in the groundwater that their ability to access that water could be impacted by this permit application. So that all makes sense. And the challenge is really developing a bill and language that achieves that intent, but doesn't negatively impact what districts are already doing under their authority in Chapter 36. And that's the challenge in any groundwater legislation, and why there's so many experts needed to change anything in that part of the code. So I think that the concerns raised about 152 was that it was a little too broad. Basically, the language in that section was pretty short and sweet. The new section in that bill saying that that the person, the applicant, shall provide notice via certified mail return receipt requested to each person with a real property interest in the groundwater beneath the land within the space prescribed by the district spacing rules. And so just a couple concerns that were raised there were, well, one, it kind of alludes that all districts must adopt spacing rules, and that's not the case for some districts. Other concerns raised were the means of providing notice, whether it should be the district or it should be the permit applicant, and then what type of notice, and the certified mail return receipt requested. That was difficult for some districts to accomplish, and whether that would cause delays in the permit application process. And then because it was kind of casting a really broad net, that language, another concern was, well, do all these people have a justiciable interest in protesting an application? So those were kind of the issues raised. And I think that the TWCA subcommittee did a lot of work to try to hone in to capture the intent that the Farm Bureau was trying to achieve in their notice without causing, more burdens on the districts or the landowner or the permit applicant. So, the bill that came out of TWCA, or that almost came out of TWCA, as Sarah mentioned, it didn't make the cut, but the votes. But that bill took into account that this notice requirement would only apply if a district had adopted spacing rules that, had spacing requirements from existing wells. And so there's a radius that you would have to provide notice from a new well to the adjacent landowners, because that new well could preempt them from drilling future well on their property. And then the means of notice, and whether it was the district or the landowner, and how the notice is provided, was kind of left up for the district to adopt rules on, based on what they prefer. And then there's a much narrower group there that you would provide notice to. So it would exclude landowners that their tracts of land did not meet the spacing requirements. If your tract of land, you were incapable of drilling a well to begin with, you wouldn't have to receive that notice. So it kind of accounted for different scenarios that districts face, narrowing in on who really would be impacted by the well and allowing those landowners to get notice. I know that Catherine and Senator Perry's office are working with stakeholders on this language. I think one of the things they're discussing and having a lot of good, meaningful discussion on is potentially having website notice of these permit applications and that being sufficient. So I think we're trying to find a solution, but get those landowners the notice that they need and probably deserve.
Yeah, thank you for that. So moving on, because that's really all we have so far. And Shauna, you've already, I think, covered this pretty well when you were speaking about the interim report, but we are anticipating seeing a bill from Senator Perry, as he mentioned, on a produced water consortium out in the Permian Basin. And I don't know if we need to cover that, or if you had anything you wanted to add real briefly on that before we move on.
No, I think we're just expecting a bill probably sometime next week. And it's, it's just more or less a advisory group working in connection with Texas Tech University. And I think it will be interesting. It's kind of a unique situation. So hopefully we can see some good come out of that.
Great. And then, it is interesting. Our bill list of bills on groundwater is very short right now. Robby, what are your thoughts on whether and what types of other groundwater bills that we haven't discussed that we might see this session?
I think that you can probably go back and reference previous sessions. And as we talked about earlier, especially when you have new members on the committee, people will take bills to them. So I don't necessarily have a list, but I think that you're going to see some very similar bills come back, and whether or not they'll make their hearings, I'm not sure. So that would be my first reference point. It's just what historically, other than you're right, it's a small amount of bills that have been filed right now. it's just historically one of the last 2 or 3 sessions from some members, especially newer members that have been on the committees, and look what's been filed just historically would probably be the good reference point that we're looking at. So I don't have any list of bills or list of necessarily issues, but I think there's always the same issues about, as Senator Perry talked about, the balance on private property rights, talked about bills that affect landowners that cover 2 different groundwater conservation districts or 2 different regulatory areas, bills that look at GMAs in general. A lot of times what we have to do is go back and give historical perspective to newer members, and not just on the committee too. There's a lot of times you'll have members that have been here for a session or 2, and someone locally will bring them a bill. They'll hear about something. Like a lot of people don't understand the 1763 and the GMA process in general, and why that was, to me, a very good compromise between protecting local management. I like to use the word management actually instead of control, but local management compared to the state coming in and managing groundwater. So I think you still have those philosophies that are out there that we just probably haven't seen something as big and omnibus as 1392 from a couple of sessions ago. So I don't know that you won't see those, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see a few bills filed by some members affecting some of the things that we've just seen from time and time again.
Thank you for that. And then Sarah, you know, there's, I guess I would maybe almost call them groundwater adjacent type bills that don't directly affect Chapter 36, but are things that at least some districts are probably keeping their eye on or may want to keep their eye on. Do you want to highlight a couple of those for us?
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of bills related to aggregate production operations that you may just watch. Overall, it's a good thing for groundwater because the bills aim to strengthen TCEQ's oversight, either through the establishment of best management practices, putting in performance bonds, or requiring reclamation plans. So those are very good things from a groundwater perspective. There's also a bill, Senate Bill 307 by Sarah Eckhart, that would authorize a person to transmit potable water by a pipeline of not more than 24 inches across 2 or more county lines for the purposes of providing wholesale water service only if you are a local government corporation. So the impact of this bill, and it's gotten a lot of attention from TWCA members, is that it essentially takes away the authority of water districts to be able to move potable wholesale water in these circumstances, and limits it to only a local government corporation, which water districts can't even create. So this bill, you know, everybody sort of speculates that the origins of this bill are probably about a local Austin area dispute and trying to put some guardrails on the movement of groundwater, but the bill does not say that. The bill has statewide impacts. It is prospective, so it does not impact any pipeline that currently exists. But as you know, there's a lot of projects that are planned and some of our members are impacted. So we are definitely having some conversations about that. And then I think, you know, just talking about bills that we might see, you know, we haven't seen any sort of bill about service area like we saw last session, which you guys will doubtless remember would have required groundwater districts to issue a permit to a retail public utility based on the acreage in their service area. But the bill filing deadline isn't until March. But I understand the Rural Water Association is not really looking to do that. There's a lot of folks just playing defense this session, so we'll see.
Thank you for that. Yes, that's a good point on the service area bill. So what about local groundwater bills, Ty? We've seen, you know, at least one filed, HB 152. Would you speak just real briefly to that, and then kind of what we might see, if anything, on other local groundwater bills?
Sure. Typically, you know, my experience in the past with legislature, you see the local bills filed, you know, closer to the filing deadline on March 12th, or some of them, because they're local bills, can be filed after that March 12th deadline. So you got local notice associated with those local bills that sometimes delays a little bit the filing process. You know, I haven't seen any yet, but it's not really surprising. We're in January and those local bills usually come later. As far as House Bill 152 by Representative Brad Buckley from the Killeen area, this is a carryover bill from last session. This was a bill that there's just a lot of interest in the area north of Austin. There's just so much growth going on, so many subdivisions going in. I-35 corridor, as everybody knows that drives that, the 35 north of Austin is just blowing up and continued to have explosive growth. So there was just an interest by several stakeholders in that area in Central Texas to have the Water Development Board, do a study to try to get a good picture of where we are. And you're looking at counties. The Water Development Board under the bill would be looking at Bell County, Burnett County, Milam, Travis, and Williamson counties, and to try to look at the aquifer characteristics and what the current use is and what the projected groundwater use is. So it's looked at as a tool to help areas north of Austin plan for the coming growth that they have and meeting their water needs.
Yeah, and we all know how important that science is, that local science. So thank you for that. All right, well, that kind of wraps up our groundwater discussion, but do want to talk about some government bills that could affect GCDs and how they operate. We've got a list up here. I'm not going to read through them all. That'll just be mumbo jumbo, but SB 234 with a companion in the House is a taxpayer funded lobbying bill. And Robby, I was hoping you could start off and talk to us about that. That, could affect tax-based GCDs as well as organizations like TAG that have taxing entities as members. That issue, though, is bigger than GCDs. That's not where it comes from. It's been around for a long time. If you could share your thoughts and some of your insights on that with the group, that would be fantastic.
Bills like this are usually in response of, and it may just be perception, in response to someone coming in between legislators and their taxpayers. And so you see, and you're right, this has been around for several sessions as far as, and it really starts with the tax issue. It started in 17, and Todd talked about this in the perception that lobbyists from the cities, if you will, from PML and other interests, when the different cities had their legislative agenda, and of course their consulting teams and their lobby teams come up here and they try to work on that agenda, and certain taxes are always the top issue for legislators whenever not only when they campaign, when they come up here. But if you look at historically what has happened last session, what we may see happen to the bill this session, the odds are it's going to come out of the Senate. I can't tell you exactly what it's going to look like, but the bill as filed by Representative Milton and by Senator Hall are identical at this point, where it's actually an outright ban on being able to have taxpayer funded lobbying. So if you look at what happened when the bill came over from the Senate side and went to the House, you looked at the debate on the floor and you watched the different amendments that were voted on, you're going to have, it's kind of like there may be three different options that we'll see. You could see the bill. I don't know whether it has enough votes right now. It didn't pass the House last time. So it's probably safe to say that there's still going to be obviously a lot of consternation between some urban members and rural members as to what the bill is going to look like as far as an outright ban. I think that obviously the leadership, Lieutenant Governor Patrick and Governor Abbott have voiced their support of some type of bill. Last session now, Speaker Phelan actually voted for the bill and was a joint author. He has publicly said that at this point in time, when asked what he would do, is that he wants the members to certainly look at this, and he wants the committee process to work, and wants the membership to weigh in on this and let the members decide themselves on what they want the bill to look like. But you're either going to see something like an outright ban, which certainly didn't get voted out of the House last time. You hear members and you hear leadership talking about transparency. Transparency is even Senator Perry, Chairman Perry, talk about transparency within the Groundwater District community. But at a larger level, whenever you look at this, the transparency issue seems to be that the taxpayers and that the citizens in these local communities understand where their cities are and where their opinions lie when it comes to who's hiring lobbyists, how many lobbyists are they hiring, the amount of money that's being spent on lobbying, and what their lobbying agenda is. So there's transparency, and there's already a lot of transparency within the law. And certainly the city's agendas are certainly open to the public. But that's one thing. If you look at some of the amendments that were filed last session, it had to do with transparency. You also had an amendment that did make it on the bill by Representative Moody, if I remember right, that
Correct.
really makes it more specific to just lobbying on tax issues. And I think that comes about because if you did look at this meeting that we're having, how bills are so complicated. In the water world, they're complicated, and a lot of different issues are, if they're so complicated, you need some professionals as we like to think, to come up here and try to not only explain it, but explain the institutional knowledge behind certain things and why there's language in statute, current language, and what happens if you file additional language. So there's a lot of issues that are outside just the taxation issue, and a lot of issues that are outside even the appraisal process issue. But so you may see 3 different iterations of the bill. I don't know which one would actually make it out of the House. I'd be very surprised that you don't see something hit the floor. And will also probably be very similar consternation on what that's going to look like. There may be more efforts to try to write the bill and get the bill as finalized as possible through the committee process, because when it does hit the floor, there is certain time constraints with COVID and the amount of time that the members are going to be on the floor. So that's really kind of an aside of the merits of the issue itself. But I think that I'd be real surprised if you didn't see something hit the floor. I can't tell you exactly what that's going to look like. Like I said, Speaker Phelan wants the members themselves to weigh in on this. It's a very, very important issue to them and certainly to their constituents and their voters. So I think there's odds are you're going to see something. I just don't know exactly what that's going to look like. And although other thing I'd like to say is a lot of times, this is an example of, let's say, collateral damage. Whenever the members are trying to, i.e. go toward political subdivisions like cities and counties and so on and so forth, because those are the ones that, that's where the biggest tax bill is, and that's where they hear from their constituents and their taxpayers is the appraisal process, or either the taxes are going up and what are the restrictions on that? I'm paying higher taxes. So the members are reacting to their constituents, and then entities like us kind of tend to get caught up in the collateral damage, if you will, with that not necessarily being the intent. And although it's part of our job is to educate and go, okay, some districts have fees, some districts have very restricted on their taxes. That's actually in statute. So part of our lobbying will probably be, okay, this is kind of how groundwater conservation districts work. And in the event that you want to have a broad bill, then this is a negative impact you're going to have for these local communities and those local taxpayers. So sometimes other entities and other political subdivisions that do implement taxes or have tax language in their bills could be collateral damage when the intent isn't to restrict how we've operated for years and operating successfully, and that there is a lot of local input on what goes into not only what the statute and maybe legislation looks at, but the district's ability to implement their taxes.
Yeah, no, those unintended consequences definitely are something that it's important to educate legislators on, and something that occurs to me with that, where we at least ended up last session with that bill and the amendment you were talking about, that kind of it limited the subject matter areas that had the ban in it, is that where do you draw that line? You say you can't lobby on tax issues, but what if you have a bill that has 100 different topics in it and one of them implicates tax? What does that mean for all of the rest? There's just a lot of questions I think that would need to be sorted out there, and appreciate your thoughts on that. So moving on, Sarah, I was hoping you could take the next 3 House bills on our list. These deal with, I think, some publication requirements and notice that would affect GCDs if they were to pass.
Yeah, these next 3 are the ones you're going to want to keep on your radar, just because they expand your options for meeting your notice requirements. As you know, the current rules are when you post, it either has to have a circulation of 51% in residences in your county or be entered as a periodical postal matter in your county. HB 634 would expand that by allowing another option if that has been published in the county and designated by either the Commissioner's Court or other official action of the political subdivision as the newspaper for the publication of those kinds of notices. House Bill 1030 expands it in a different way. It talks about alternative media. And what it would allow is that instead of publishing in a newspaper, you could post the notice on your website, on a website maintained by the comptroller, and on certain alternative media. And that alternative media has to have greater circulation than the newspaper in the county. So what we mean by that is really social media. It could be other types of free or school newspapers, HOA newsletters, utility bills, things that are widespread in distribution in a county. If you're going to end up using this alternative media, there are a lot of requirements that have to be met, and you have to certify that through the comptroller. So there's an additional process that goes along with that. And on House Bill 1154, there are a couple of pieces of this, but the biggest one is applicable to special districts that have taxing authority. And it has a pretty exhaustive list of the kinds of things that you would need to post on your website, from your organization's name, board members, terms, contact info, name of your GM, utility operator, your tax assessor collector, your tax rate, notice of all your tax hearings, notices and minutes. It's a pretty long list of things, and that's not even all of them. So put that on your radar if you are funded by taxes.
It makes me think of how, Senator Perry and I chatted briefly about the legislature meeting every year, and with all these requirements potentially changing so frequently, it would really be hard to keep on top of it if you had this happening annually as opposed to every other year. No time to catch up and make sure you're in compliance. Thank you for that, Sarah. So the last one on the list, HB 768. Ty, I was hoping you could speak to that. That's about audio and video recordings of open meetings.
Right. It applies to any political subdivision that's located either wholly or partially in a county of 5,000 people or more. You have to make a video and audio recording of each regularly scheduled meeting that the district holds, and post that on your, on the internet, the website that a political subdivision has. So I think this is one of those, and I know this is increased transparency effort that's been going on at the legislature for years for governmental entities, political subdivisions, but I think COVID's really highlighted that as far as the use of technology to really try to open up and make these governmental entities like groundwater districts more accessible to the public.
Mm-hmm. And in that bill, one thing that I noticed is that it requires posting on the internet, but it doesn't necessarily require you post it on your own website. It could be a website like YouTube or somewhere
Facebook.
else.
Yeah, it just says on the internet. So that it could be on your, like you just said, Leah, it could be on your own website as a political entity, or like you said, you can use a YouTube, Facebook Live, whatever you want to use. But there's just, like Robby said earlier, transparency has gotten a lot of attention and will continue to in the future.
Yeah, and actually, I was going to ask you, do you think we're going to be seeing any other open meetings bills with this whole, the last 8 to 10 months of virtual meetings and the opening up of some of those open meetings requirements? Might some of those become permanent?
Yes, I think there's some legislators and staff that are working now on some bills that will amend the Open Meetings Act to and use the technology that we've gotten comfortable with, or more comfortable with, over the last year to enable people the public to participate. I've had districts that have had more public participation than they've ever had through COVID because of the virtual nature of their meetings. So I think you're going to see. And you're talking all kinds of subdivisions political subdivisions have experienced that. So I definitely know there's definitely some bills that are being worked on to be filed that will amend the Open Meetings Act to incorporate the technology.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like I heard recently that the regional water planning groups are, that's an area where they would like to potentially be able to continue to meet virtually when they're spread out geographically to get their work done a bit more efficiently. So thanks for that. Well, we have about 5 minutes left. Thank you all for covering a lot of material. And I'm just checking here to see if we've got any submitted. I don't have any yet.
Greg Ellis hadn't submitted a question? What's the world coming to?
You got called out.
Yeah, no, the ones that the questions that had come in actually all got covered in our main presentation. So I guess what I would maybe just do at this point then is give you each just a minute closing thoughts for the session. And Robby, why don't we start with you? We'll just go down the line based on the way I see you guys on the camera.
Well, I'll just take the time to reiterate what Shauna said earlier about contacting the legislators' offices. And actually even through the districts, if it's local groundwater district managers or members or down there, districts in those who have district offices, they're busier nowadays. So you can email the district office and either set up a Zoom meeting through there or a meeting through there. But I think Shauna hit the nail on the head. If you're even the district offices, but certainly if you're trying to walk around the Capitol, it's very good advice that she gave about contacting that office first and let them know, ask them how they operate, how they want to communicate, whether by email or Zoom, or especially depending on the issue, they may say, okay, send me an email, send me some information, and then let's set up a meeting. A lot of times that's what we're seeing. There's even places where you can put something in a drop box outside, and they'll say, well, please drop your information in the drop box and let me know when you're going to do that. So they'll open
A real drop box, not a virtual drop box, like a real drop.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Actually, a good point, Ty. A real drop box, and you say, okay, I just dropped it in. So just to give you an FYI, and you pop it in the box and leave, and they open the door and grab it and read it, and contact you if they need to do a follow up. So I think Shauna hit the nail on the head. Contact the offices before you just do a drive by, so to speak, and it saves everybody a lot of time, and they appreciate that too.
Well, thank you. And Sarah, I'm going to go to you next, but actually a question did come in that goes to some of the content you covered. So I was going to ask you that question first and then give you a moment to kind of share a closing thought. There are times the Capitol is open. What about late committee hearings, and what about testing times? Are the testing centers going to be open if someone arrives at 8 p.m. because the committee hearing is going until midnight? Do you have any insights or information on how that kind of all fits together?
Well, and certainly other folks on the panel can weigh in on what they're hearing, and we haven't gotten there yet, so we don't know. The idea is with the rapid testing that you can get that done in 15 minutes. Now, if there's a long line to be able to get in there, then you could see some holdups. I don't know how many people anticipate going to the Capitol and doing that and participating in person versus sort of staying back and doing their business virtually. So we will see. I think some of the idea too is that if you can spread out your committee meetings on more days, that may not be as many meetings, and then you may not have them go as long. And that sort of I would use that transition into my closing comments, which are you just got to be flexible, because as COVID evolves and our reactions change, rules may change in 60 days. You may have multiple starts and stops of committee meeting in the floor action, convening. I think you're going to see less of stuff and slower, right? You're probably not going to have as many bills, as many committee hearings, probably going to have less testimony. So it's shorter meetings. Same with going to the floor, probably less bills going to the floor, less debate and question and answers, because people don't want to be down there and in the pit for that long. So we'll see.
Thank you. Moving on to you, Shauna. Any closing thoughts?
I'd like to just close by saying a couple things about the taxpayer-funded lobbying bill. I guess that's what that's what I call it, but in reality, it's not the taxpayer-funded lobbying bill. It's political subdivisions or political entities, public funds lobbying bill. So, even if you are a fee-based district, you're encompassed under this bill. And they, this was on the ballot for the Republican primaries back in March. This is a #1 priority. And I know that there are some members who understand that local voices are heard through the lobbying and organizations efforts like TWCA. Otherwise, you just have, like in the utility world, you just have the big utility steamrolling, and you don't have the smaller folks coming in and, having a voice on behalf of like people that are being steamrolled by the utilities. So, you know, there's a lot of things at play here, and it's really important that local folks are heard, and it's not just the big companies running over them. And when I say we need to really be on this, I don't mean that the lobbyists need to be on it. The people on this panel are not the ones that need to be fighting that fight. They want to hear from the folks at home, including groundwater districts, and know about the work that y'all do. So I know that some of those members were not usually those committees reaching out to, but you know, it's important for y'all to reach out to them and educate them on what you do and why local control is important and having a voice at the Capitol is important. So I just want to, you know, keep that in mind and make sure that, you know, we're on top of that. There is a pretty big gap, a big spread. I think it was a 27 vote spread last session on it, but they've been working this issue and it's going to be big. So I would just encourage y'all to reach out to your members and let them know how you feel about it. Virtually.
Good point.
Virtually. Set up that
Good
Zoom
point.
meeting. Yeah,
I would-
Todd, we'll close with you. You get the last word.
Right before the break. So yeah, no, I couldn't agree. I think everybody that's made comments before me has made great comments. I agree with them. I just, you know, I think the word flexibility, Sarah used that. I would say patience to go along with that for this session. You don't know, you remember that might be carrying a bill for you, might get COVID and might not even be able to participate the day you're anticipating a committee hearing on your bill, for example. So be patient. The legislature is always a nerve-wracking time, but we'll get through it. And you know, you got a lot of good people in the groundwater world working to try to, you know, help groundwater districts. And you know, the final thing I'll say on a humorous note, with the agriculture committee being dissolved and being added back into the water agriculture and rural affairs committee, now we'll get to hear a lot more of all about deer breeding and all those kinds of bills during the Senate committee hearings that we missed out on the last session. So
Dang it.
Do you not remember the macaque monkeys?
The hogs.
Go ahead, the hogs.
We're definitely going to be, you'll definitely hear feral hogs, all kinds of deer breeding bills. So just to prepare you when you tune in to watch on the water bills, you're going to get educated on a lot of other issues too. So, but yeah, you know, we just need to, I couldn't agree more with all the comments that were previously made, and please contact your legislator and express your interests of what bills you're interested in, and because they want to hear from you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. This has been, we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of fantastic insights and perspectives from each of you. Appreciate you joining us. And we will, you know, continue to fight the good fight as we enter into a very interesting session.